Hey there. Welcome back to 31 Days of Horror, and we are on day 23 today. I checked out a movie. It's called Lucky Bastard. It was made in 2014, and I found this little gem hanging out in the horror section on Amazon Prime Video. At this point in the month, it is kind of difficult to find more prominent, talked about films that I haven't already seen. Uh, to watch and review. So, usually towards the back end of the month is when I start, just kind of picking movies where the description might sound interesting, but there isn't really anything noteworthy about them otherwise, or I've never heard of them before. So I just kind of have to go by general vibes. Um, the premise of this movie is that there's an adult film website that predominantly makes kind of niche fetish film. And they have a contest on their website for subscribers where they can put in an application and a winner is drawn, and they are called the Lucky Bastard. And their grand prize is that they get to film a scene with a prominent porn star. The porn star in question in this particular movie, her name is Ashley Saint. She's prominent in the adult film industry in this movie itself. And the lucky bastard, his name is Dave, and he's a little bit cringy, seems a little nice guy-ish. But originally, the main actress, she's very reluctant to film this because he's an amateur, she's a professional, she's not comfortable with the situation. And just through, general things, she agrees to it. And then the movie kind of, gets started from there. Casting wise, this isn't necessarily filled with casting wise, this isn't filled with people we've never seen before. The biggest name is probably Don McManus. You may not recognize his name, but I can almost guarantee you that you would recognize his face. Or his voice. He has lent his voice and his face to quite a few projects, 167 acting credits according to his IMDb. And one of them is as the voice of David in the Life is Strange video game that came out, which was something that I played myself. I watched a lot of gameplay of, and so that was very familiar to me. He also did a stint on the show Boston Legal as playing an ADA on that show, and so he may be familiar from that. And he also played a role in the movie National Treasure with Nicolas Cage. And he also was on an episode of Supernatural, and I think I've mentioned it before in other films that, especially in the horror genre, it's really hard. Like, you can throw a rock and hit somebody who's probably been in an episode of Supernatural. The show is on for a very long time, and they have a far reach in different, areas. So besides Don McManus, it also stars Chris Wilde, who that might be a name that you recognize from like late 90s, early 2000s. He did a lot of kind of like goofy MTV style things back then. But in recent years, you might recognize him predominantly from the Babysitter movies that Netflix made. He plays the neighbor, the kind of burnout stoner father of the girl next door. Kind of a comic relief character in that sense. And he plays sort of a comic relief character in this as well. And then the main event, Ashley Saint, is played by an actress whose name is Betsy Rue. And she looked very familiar to me, and I couldn't figure out, why while I was watching the movie. And then I looked up her IMDb, only to find that she played the role of Ginger Fox on an episode of iCarly. And despite the fact that I watch a lot of horror films, I also watched an awful lot of iCarly while it was on because it was something mindless and easy that I could just turn on and not really think about. So I've seen every episode, and I've also seen every episode of the reboot that Amazon did as well. So that is actually where I recognized Betsy Rue from. So this film is, I'm going to come right out and say at the very beginning, I would not consider this a horror film. There are horror elements. The theme is a horror theme. But the movie itself, I think it plays out a lot more like a drama. It has no scares. This feels like it was miscategorized. But that being said, I can also see where they were coming from with the horror aspect, but it just didn't get there. I kind of stayed as as a drama, and it was fine overall. I don't think it was anything particularly special. I don't think it was anything particularly bad. I think it was well acted. I think the thought was there. I just think they needed to go a lot further if they wanted it to be horror, or they needed to refine a lot more if they wanted it to be a true drama kind of thriller. Right as it stands, it has the production values of like a B horror movie with the rough storyline of a good drama. Um, the acting was relatively convincing as far as the roles are concerned and the events that unfold. So it certainly wasn't, you know, any acting, and it certainly wasn't, you know, the production's fault necessarily. I'm just not entirely sure that this film really knew what it wanted to be. I think it had a story it wanted to tell, and I certainly don't think that was a bad story. I think it was definitely an interesting story, and despite the fact that the movie's 10 years old, I think this story actually is even more prominent now with the rise of sites like OnlyFans and adult entertainment becoming a lot more accessible, becoming a lot more prominent, and people kind of branching out on their own, making their own decisions, you know, in those respects. And I also think it's interesting to note that the overall vibe toward the adult industry hasn't really changed, even though it's become a lot more prominent. Um, and so there's a lot of themes in this movie that this film brings up that I think are incredibly relevant, even today, even the movie being 10 years old. Um, a lot of it has to do with consent. A lot of it has to do with the dynamics in a not only sexual based relationships, but the dynamics in the sex industry, the treatment of different people, the when lines get blurred between professional, casual, you know, relationships, when bosses abuse their privileges, you know, abuse their power, um, and the fact that when you interact with people on the internet, you never really know who you're interacting with. And the internet kind of gives us all this mask that we can put on and pretend to be whoever we want to be. And unless you know somebody in real life, it's very difficult. You can't look at somebody and say, yeah, they look like a nice guy, or yeah, they look like a jerk, or yeah, they look like this, because everybody online is wearing a mask of some sort. Um, and I think this movie kind of, you know, goes into that. So all that being said, I can see where this had the potential to be a really good movie. However, it's not, and I don't recommend it really to anybody, because you're not missing anything by not seeing it. As far as a horror entry, I almost feel like I should watch a different movie because I don't even think this one counts because it's not horror. Um, Not traditional horror, anyway. It kind of sets you up. The opening scene is police officers going through a house with flashlights and finding bodies, which is that's a horror setup. It's pretty typical. We've seen that in quite a few movies. We saw that, you know, in Texas Chainsaw Massacre. We saw that in some of the later Halloween entries. So that's a pretty common opener for horror films. Then it goes to the, oh, you know, the week previous or a few days earlier. I don't even remember the time, but previously. And when we're looking at, you know, the previously, then that's building up. I think my biggest criticism of this is I think the movie could have built tension a lot better, and I think the movie could have really introduced more of that horror element if they had focused more on developing the feeling of the movie than they did on character development. Because quite honestly, they did character development on so many people in this film. I mean, they did character development on the bigger characters in the film. They did character development on the smaller characters in the film. They did, development on their relationships and on the things they have going on off screen and all of these things, which was, on one hand, it was really cool to see a very humanizing view of the adult film industry, because I think it's really easy for us to sort of categorize the people in the adult film industry as like prostitutes and whores. Um, which is not my personal view, but I think that's an easy category that we kind of throw those people in. So then when you do introduce them to kind of porn plots, they appear almost as disposable to the audience because we've categorized them as this cultural other. People who work in the sex industry are, a cultural other. So it's okay. They're not like us. And that's something that's been very prominent in the horror genre for a long time. It's one of the reasons why there's always the damsel in distress. She's viewed as, the damsel in distress is usually a virgin. So there's that protect the purity sort of, puritanical view of gender roles. Also, minorities are usually for the long time, there's been running jokes about minorities in films are usually the first to die. And that's carried on, even to, current situations. There's jokes about it in a lot of films. And the reason for that is because we put minorities in this category of cultural other, where we can then do mental gymnastics to justify their impending doom on horror screens, because we've put them in a different category than we put ourselves to make it less scary. And I think this movie actually does a really good job of humanizing everyone in the movie and making it very clear that all of this is just a job. It's just another job. It's like working at the grocery store. It's like being a postman. You just have sex for money on camera. That is your job. And I really appreciate that. I really appreciate that viewpoint of the industry. Because really, if you don't have autonomy over your own body, then what do you really have in life? And so I like that sort of, that vibe. Unfortunately, when the story kind of unfolds, there really aren't any horror elements to it. There are some scenes that are uncomfortable. That are, I would say, significant because they're uncomfortable, but none of it amounts to like horror. It's more like, it kind of feels more like like a drawn out episode of Law and Order SVU that focuses more on the victims than it does on the cops who are investigating. But also, I wanted to talk about a little bit the fact that the adult film industry comes up in horror, or the adult industry revolving around, sex and sexual things, comes up a lot in the horror genre. And we've talked a little bit in previous videos about, exploitation films. And we also talked about, when I watched Maxine, we talked a little bit about, porn actresses or porn stars trying to, break into regular cinema, and how difficult that is, and that previously, horror was sort of viewed along the same lines as pornography, as kind of those video nasties that, are looked down on or are sort of judged for you watching them. And there is a lot to be said between those two genres, and there are ways to kind of meet them in creative ways that I've seen other horror films do and do better. I talked about the film when I watched Maxine, but the movie X is a very good example of blending adult film and horror very successfully, as far as I'm concerned. Another outing that it also kind of meshes these two, and it is also on the older side, is a movie that was made in 2008 called One-Eyed Monster. And it's a bizarre movie, so bear with me here. But it stars Amber Benson, who played Tara on Buffy the Vampire Slayer. That's the most prominent role that I can think of. And it also includes Ron Jeremy. And the premise of this movie is that there is an adult film crew. They are filming a movie out in I know there's a barn involved. They're kind of like at a remote, kind of like cabin in the woods sort of situation. There's some sort of like meteor strike. There's an alien involved. But long story short, Ron Jeremy's, one-eyed monster essentially gets possessed by this alien and then proceeds to murder everyone. It is not attached to him when it is doing these things. And it is bizarre. It is funny. It is goofy. And of course, we know that Ron Jeremy has turned out to not be the greatest of people. So I'm certainly not advocating for him in any sense, just that he's involved in this movie. And that his little friend is the main event in this movie. Those two films, I think, did adult film and horror mixed together very successfully, very in an entertaining way, and came out the other side, kind of true horror. This movie leaves a little bit to be desired. It's another one of those movies I will forget. I have seen this movie. I might remember it, when I'm going through lists. If I happen to see it come up again, I'd be like, oh, I think I've seen that. I might remember that. But that being said, there weren't prominent scenes. There wasn't, really great lines. There wasn't visually anything really to latch onto. And the scare vibe, the anxiety, the stress that you normally get when you're watching horror, there was really none of that. There weren't even any jump scares. So I don't really think this film was successful. And I don't really recommend that anybody watch it. Like I said, if you're welcome to, I don't necessarily think it's bad, but I kind of think it would be almost a waste of your time because there's nothing to gain from it and you're not losing anything by not having seen it. If you are interested in horror films that do tie into the adult film industry or the adult industry in general, then I would recommend checking out X. That's Ti West's first movie. He did X, then he did Pearl, then he did Maxine. I would also recommend you check out One-Eyed Monster. It's entertaining and goofy and silly, and it is horror and gore and all of that, so you'll have fun, with that. And then there's one other film that isn't exactly horror per se, but the film, I'm looking it up right now because I am totally forgetting the name of this movie. Let me see here. Oh, this movie, so it's not necessarily considered a horror movie, but there are some, it's more of a comedy and it is more of drama, but if you're looking for something that kind of deals with some similar topics, not horror, like I said, there's a movie called Girl 6 by Spike Lee. that I do remember seeing, and it kind of just explores a little bit of the comedic side and a little bit of the drama having to do with a phone sex worker. Um, I'm really a big fan of anything that can kind of humanize people who are just trying to make a living and they're choosing to use their body or their voice or their sexuality to do so. I don't personally think that there's anything wrong with that, as long as everybody's a consenting adult. Um, and I definitely think that um, if you're interested, like I said, in these kinds of films, I definitely think there are better options out there for you. So I'd love to know what you think. I'd love to hear some recommendations so I can avoid watching another stinker, for the last few days that we have of October. And I will talk to y'all tomorrow. Have a great day.